Then I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. It had 7 heads and 10 horns with 10 crowns on its horns, and written on each head were names that blasphemed God. This beast looked like a leopard, but it had the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave the beast his own power and throne and great authority. The sea prophetically represents the massive godless people of the world. God told Isaiah, "But those who still reject me are like the restless sea, which is never still, but continually churns up mud and dirt." So the Antichrist will be a Gentile who will come out of the sea of the world's godless people. Isaiah may narrow his nationality down still further too. In understanding biblical prophecy, we have something known as the babushka principle. This principle says that Bible prophecy follows a cyclical or repeating pattern. This means that many of the prophecies have a short-term meaning which applied very narrowly to the people of that time, but also, sometimes without the prophets knowing, a broader scope, long-term, more universal meaning or fulfillment, which applies to the future of the world. This principle means that we can help discern the future by learning from the past, and it also means that prophecies can often have more than one meaning, an historical meaning and a future meaning. Using that principle, we see in Isaiah's writings a description of an Assyrian whose characteristics are strikingly similar to those of the Antichrist. "What sorrow awaits Assyria, the rod of my anger? I use it as a club to express my anger. I am sending Assyria against a godless nation, against a people with whom I am angry. Assyria will plunder them, trampling them like dirt beneath its feet. But the king of Assyria will not understand that he is my tool. His mind does not work that way. His plan is simply to destroy, to cut down nation after nation." Isaiah wrote this around the time that Assyria had taken Israel into captivity. Therefore, it could just be a reference to that time period only. However, using the babushka principle, I want to suggest that this has a future meaning and that we are reading about a description of the Antichrist here. This passage tells us about an Assyrian cutting down nation after nation. That is, the world at first, but then more specifically, him being used by God to conquer Israel to fulfill his wrath against them. This fits exactly with our Revelation study, where we have learned that the Antichrist will conquer the nations at first with an army of 200 million, but then more specifically will trample over Israel so that God's wrath against them can be fulfilled. Like the Assyrian here, the Antichrist doesn't realize that he is merely being used as God's tool to complete a 7-year debt. He believes that he is doing it all in his own strength. As such, he is described as being proud, arrogant, and boastful. In fact, he believes himself to be invincible. Isaiah writes, "He is proud and arrogant. He boasts, 'By my own powerful arm I have done this. With my own shrewd wisdom I planned it. I have broken down the defenses of nations and carried off their treasures. I have knocked down their kings like a bull. I have robbed their nests of riches and gathered up kingdoms as a farmer gathers eggs. No one can even flap a wing against me or utter a peep of protest.'" Assyria doesn't exist today, but around the time that Isaiah was written, they had an empire that primarily covered the areas of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and western Iran, the 4 nations around the Euphrates that were brought to our attention during the 5th trumpet. If I had to be specific, I would suggest that the Antichrist will come from Syria, and I'll explain the reasons later. What about this odd description of the beast, though? It had 7 heads and 10 horns with 10 crowns in its horns, and written on each head were names that blasphemed God. This beast looked like a leopard, but it had the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave the beast his own power and throne and great authority. What kind of bizarre creature will the Antichrist actually be? Well, again, this is just prophetic imagery. Don't expect him to literally look like a leopard-lion-bear hybrid. In order to translate this image, we must first notice the similarities with the earlier description of the dragon, which was also said to have 7 heads and 10 horns. This tells us that the Antichrist will be the very image of Satan on earth, in the same way that Jesus Christ was the very image of God. As for insight into the meaning of the animals, we can find some if we turn to Daniel. We're going on a detour here, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Daniel writes, "Earlier, during the 1st year of King Belshazzar's reign in Babylon, Daniel had a dream and saw visions as he lay in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and this is what he saw. In my vision that night, I, Daniel, saw a great storm churning the surface of a great sea, with strong winds blowing from every direction. Then 4 huge beasts came out of the water, each different from the others. The first beast was like a lion with eagle's wings. As I watched, its wings were pulled off, and it was left standing with its 2 hind feet on the ground like a human being, and it was given a human mind. Then I saw a second beast, and it looked like a bear. It was rearing up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And I heard a voice saying to it, "Get up, devour the flesh of many people." Then the third of these strange beasts appeared, and it looked like a leopard. It had 4 birds' wings on its back, and it had 4 heads. Great authority was given to this beast. Then in my vision that night I saw a 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, and very strong. It devoured and crushed its victims with huge iron teeth, and trampled their remains beneath its feet. It was different from any of the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. As I was looking at the horns, suddenly another small horn appeared among them. 3 of the first horns were torn out by the roots to make room for it. This little horn had eyes like human eyes, and a mouth that was boasting arrogantly. I watched as the thrones were put in place, and the Ancient One sat down to judge. His clothing was as white as snow, his hair was like purest wool. He sat on a fiery throne with wheels of blazing fire, and a river of fire was pouring out, flowing from his presence. Millions of angels ministered to him, many millions stood to attend him. Then the court began its session, and the books were opened. And please note at this point that this intermission describing God holding court tells us that this event is taking place during the day of God's judgment or wrath. I continued to watch because I could hear the little horn's boastful speech. I kept watching until the 4th beast was killed and its body was destroyed by fire. The other 3 beasts had their authority taken from them, but they were allowed to live a little while longer. As my vision continued that night, I saw someone like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. He was given authority, honor, and sovereignty over all the nations of the world, so that people of every race and nation and language would obey him. His rule is eternal. It will never end. His kingdom will never be destroyed. The details of this vision could still be quite puzzling, but thankfully Daniel asked for clarification on what he had just seen. I, Daniel, was troubled by all I had seen, and my visions terrified me. So I approached one of those standing beside the throne and asked him what it all meant. He explained it to me like this. These 4 huge beasts represent 4 kingdoms that will arise from the earth, but in the end, the holy people of the Most High will be given the kingdom, and they will rule forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast, the one so different from the others and so terrifying. It had devoured and crushed its victims with iron teeth and bronze claws, trampling their remains beneath its feet. I also asked about the 10 horns on the 4th beast's head, and the little horn that came up afterwards and destroyed 3 of the other horns. This horn had seemed greater than the others, and it had human eyes and a mouth that was boasting arrogantly. As I watched, this horn was waging war against God's holy people and was defeating them until the Ancient One, the Most High, came and judged in favor of his people. Then the time arrived for the holy people to take over the kingdom. Then he said to me, "This 4th beast is the 4th world power that will rule the earth. It will be different from all the others. It will devour the whole world, trampling and crushing everything in its path. Its 10 horns are 10 kings who will rule that empire. Then another king will arise, different from the other 10, who will subdue 3 of them. He will defy the Most High and oppress the holy people of the Most High. He will try to change their sacred festivals and laws, and they will be placed under his control for a time, times, and half a time." So to simplify, Daniel is told that 4 empires would arise from the earth. The first 3 would have a period of dominance, but none would compare with the 4th, which is an end-time kingdom that would somehow encapsulate or incorporate the previous 3, either literally or in essence, and in doing so, it would devour the whole world. In other words, the 4th kingdom would be the world's first truly global empire. It would be a one-world government. Under this system, the world will be divided into 10 regions, and each region will be led by its own ruler. This is represented in the image by the 10 horns with 10 crowns. However, one man, a little horn, will rise up from within the system of governance, and he will come to overrule them all. He will particularly subdue 3 of the rulers who would appear to be resistant to his authority, and ultimately he will become the most powerful man in the world, a kind of global dictator. And this is the Antichrist. So you'll notice that when the Bible is talking about this 4th beast, it's talking about an empire on the one hand, but it's also talking about the little horn who dominates this empire. Therefore it gives him human characteristics. It says that he has human eyes and a human mouth and can make boastful speeches. It also tells us that he is the one causing Jacob's trouble by waging war against God's holy people and defeating them until the Ancient One, the Most High, came and judged in favor of his people. The Antichrist will rule this final global empire right up until the return of the Most High, that is, Jesus Christ. This description of 4 consecutive empires that culminates in an end-time global empire was revealed to Daniel in another way, through a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had. Daniel tells the king what he dreamt and then interprets. In your vision, your majesty, you saw standing before you a huge shining statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of the iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. That was the dream. Now we will tell the king what it means. Your majesty, you are the greatest of the kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you the ruler over all the inhabited world, and has put even the wild animals and birds under your control. You are the head of gold. But after your kingdom comes to an end, another kingdom inferior to yours will rise to take your place. After that kingdom has fallen, yet a 3rd kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. Following that kingdom, there will be a 4th one, as strong as iron. That kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts will be as weak as clay. This mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. During the reigns of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. Again we see a succession of 4 kingdoms, this time represented by a statue, with the 4th and final one being a global empire with 10 rulers, represented by 10 toes at the feet of the statue. The nations of the world will try to form alliances at this time for unity, and even though that endeavour won't be an unqualified success, the empire will surpass all the previous great empires. It will remain on earth until Jesus Christ himself, the rock not cut from human hands, smashes it to pieces and then sets up his own kingdom on earth. It's important to note that the Antichrist global empire can be destroyed no other way. You see, historically, whenever national tyrants have come to the fore, there have always been other national leaders to fight back and defeat them. For every Adolf Hitler, there's been a Winston Churchill. However, if a global political structure is put in place and it's backed by a global constitution, and if a global dictator rises to the top of that system and he's put in charge of the entire planet's assets, intelligence databases, and military machinery, there will be no human entity left to stand against the tyranny. We'd be looking for someone outside of this world to come in and rescue us. That's why the Bible says that this end-time global empire will not be smashed by any human army, but by Jesus Christ himself upon his second coming. When he does so, all traces of the 4 kingdoms will disappear, and he will then establish his own rule throughout the earth. Can we be specific about what these 4 kingdoms represent? Many people argue about what the four kingdoms represent in the belief that identifying the first three historical kingdoms will help us identify the prophetic fourth kingdom from afar. I don't necessarily buy into that theory. I think that when the leaders of the world decide that we need a one-world government divided into 10 regions with 10 rulers over those regions, it's going to be blatantly obvious to any believers on earth at that time that the fourth kingdom has just been put into place and the Antichrist's arrival is imminent. In other words, regardless of what we believe the first three historical kingdoms to be, the fourth is going to be such an unmissable fulfillment of prophecy that our interpretations of the previous three won't actually matter too much. And indeed, you'll notice that Daniel doesn't seem to be much interested in the first three kingdoms either. He just wants to know why this fourth beast looks so much different from the rest. That's his focus. Having said that, it's worth looking at the various theories that have been put forward regarding the four kingdoms. The classic view of the four kingdoms is that the first gold head or lion kingdom is Babylon, the second bear kingdom is Medo-Persia, the third leopard kingdom is Greece, and the fourth kingdom of iron is Rome. Babylon is specifically identified as the head of gold by Daniel, so there's not much debate there. The Medes and Persians then invaded Babylon, and that's represented by the chest with two arms. Next, the Greek Empire started off unified but was divided into two after the death of Alexander the Great, and that's signified by the belly of the statue dividing into two thighs. The fourth kingdom of Rome then had two centres, Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east, hence the two iron legs on the statue. Since the feet of the statue also contains iron mixed with clay, it is therefore believed that the Roman Empire will be resurrected in the end times. This theory obviously places a great deal of suspicion on the European Union, which was initiated with the Treaty of Rome and perhaps the Catholic Church. A second school of thought, which could be termed the Western perspective, says that Great Britain has always been represented by a lion and the United States has always been represented by an eagle. So when the Bible talks about the first empire as a lion with eagle's wings and then says its wings were pulled off, we can't help but notice that the United States was once a British colony, the two countries were once connected, and that after the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, when the lion had its wings pulled off, so to speak, Britain went on to establish the largest empire in world history. This view hits a snag, however, when we consider that Daniel already specifically identifies the first kingdom as Babylon, not Britain. That should kill this theory stone dead, but for the sake of knowing the different points of view, let's go on to consider that this perspective then says that the second bear kingdom is Russia, which had a communist empire of sorts in the Soviet Union days, and which since the 19th century has been symbolized by a bear. Most significantly, the Charter for the United Nations was written by Algar Hiss, a convicted communist spy who was a cohort of Joseph Stalin. Therefore, the United Nations was initiated with the idea of forming a global socialist government. What about the third kingdom that looked like a leopard and which had 4 birds' wings on its back and 4 heads? The Western perspective says that the leopard is most closely associated with Germany, while the national symbol of France is a rooster. Put the two together and you get an empire ruled by a Franco-German alliance. I can actually find no evidence that leopards have ever symbolized Germany. The only connection seems to be that their military use a tank called the Leopard, but that's a tenuous link, and it's another blow to the Western perspective. However, it is true to say that the European Union is now completely dominated by a Franco-German alliance. So the Western perspective is that the final global empire will somehow incorporate the ideas, essence and character of these previous empires involving Rome, Britain, America, Germany, France, Russia, the European Union and United Nations. Then finally, there's the Eastern view. Eastern scholars say that God never concerns himself prophetically with Europe or the West, and that end-time prophecy focuses entirely on the Middle East. Therefore, they would say that the lion it represents Babylon, which is Iraq, The bear represents Persia, which is Iran, and up until this point they actually agree with the classic view, but then they deviate and say that the third leopard kingdom represents the Ottoman Empire of the Turks. They believe that the Fourth World Empire will therefore be an Islamic one that comes out of those fifth trumpet nations by the Euphrates. And since Iraq, Iran and Turkey have already had their day as empire capitals, they believe the Fourth Empire will be based in Syria, most likely Damascus. That's where the Assyrian Antichrist is likely to come from in their view. Is there any evidence that Muslims are working towards creating a new empire? Well, quite a lot actually. In fact, it's no secret that Muslims are trying to create a kind of United States of Islam under one spiritual leader. The Islamic word for empire is caliphate, and although they haven't had a caliphate recently, they have had several in the past. During Muhammad's life, they were united under his rule from 570 to 632 AD. Immediately after him came the Rashidun Caliphate, and that was succeeded by the Umayyad Caliphate. Following that came the Abbasid Caliphate, and then finally the most recent, the largest and perhaps the most well-known Islamic Caliphate was the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. It ended on March the 3rd, 1924. Ever since the ending of the Ottoman Empire, Muslims have fundamentally been in disarray, divided by factions and infighting. All the while, as they see it, the dark shadow of the West has engulfed the world. They believe that the 20th century saw Western capitalism and liberalism bringing chaos, inequality, despotism, and international disorder. They believe the only solution for the whole planet is a new Islamic caliphate. According to Islamic prophecy, they believe the next caliphate will indeed be a global one, and that it will be ushered in by the 12th Imam, or Al-Mahdi, the Muslim Messiah. They believe this man will be a direct descendant of Muhammad and thus will be able to unify the entire Islamic world. In their prophetic writings they see all the Islamic nations deferring ultimate authority to him as he wages war in the West, defeating it and imposing Sharia law, and reigning unchallenged for 7 years over a global empire. You can read about the Muslim plan for an end-time caliphate by going to this website. When we consider how the Muslim Brotherhood are currently trying to consolidate authority throughout the Middle East by agitating uprisings and revolutions, we can see that their long-term intention is to create the necessary conditions for the appearance of the Mahdi and his unified Islamic empire. The Arab Spring will not lead to freedom and democracy in the Middle East. Instead, it will lead to the political and cultural domination of Islam. When we compare all the views of the end-time kingdom, the classic, Western and Eastern, we can see why people would hold to any one of them, although I have to say that the Western view is by far the weakest. But I would suggest that it will go something like this. All world leaders will willingly work together to create a global political structure which joins nations together and centralizes authority. We've already seen projects like this embodied in the European Union and the United Nations. We've also seen organizations like the G8 and G20 rise to prominence, and this is underpinned by a desire for greater cohesion in solving global issues, global warming, global security, the global economy, etc. Indeed, politicians, the super-rich elite, spiritual gurus and members of secret societies have been talking about creating a one-world order for many years.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
News, debate, and opinion for Tuesday, March 3rd. Live from New York, Lou Dobbs.
Good evening, everybody. President Obama and British Prime Minister Gordon today calling for a new world order to tackle our global economic crisis.
And I believe it will also be said of this age, the first decade of the 21st century, that out of what will be seen as the greatest restructuring of the global economy, perhaps one even greater than at the time of the Industrial Revolution, a new world order was created.
I think its task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity.
the affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
This will all lead to a time when a global constitution will come into play that all nation states will sign up to, believing it to be the path to world peace and prosperity. The earth will then be divided into 10 regions, and a council of 10 leaders will be appointed to rule each of those regions. This global empire will obviously require Middle Eastern representation, and since Muslims will have been busy wiping out Christians and consolidating their power in that region, the World Council representative for the Middle East will probably be Muslim. Because of political correctness and spiritual blindness, we would expect the leaders in Europe and the West to support that, especially if the man in question initially presents himself as a peaceful moderate or even hides a spiritual allegiance altogether. All it would take is for that man to unveil his true identity once in power, or for a successor to come along after him, unite the Islamic world as their messianic Mahdi, send out the call for the 200 million to gather so that Islamic prophecy might be fulfilled, and from that region wipe out a third of the world's population. Having conquered many nations and having taken advantage of the new political structure, he will finally turn on Israel, the nation that causes the greatest affront to the Muslim mind. Jacob's trouble will then begin, and the true nature of this man as the Antichrist will be revealed. This is indeed how Islamic prophecy itself predicts the last hour. Their prophecies say, the last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews. The Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, Muslim or the servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. But the tree Garhad would not say, for it is the tree of the Jews. In other words, I believe the framework of the one world order will be established by all the world leaders, but it will be hijacked from within by the Antichrist. The little horn will rise up from within the system once it's already been established. Whatever our thoughts about the first three kingdoms, I will repeat that Daniel actually pays very little attention to them. It's the fourth that really intrigues him. And whatever identity we attach to the previous three, it doesn't really affect the obvious nature of the fourth. An empire, global, 10 rulers, dominated by one, comes in peace, turns violent halfway through, subdues the earth first, then turns on Jerusalem. People are going to know it when they see it.